Hey there, everybody. Um, for those of you who are already afraid, I don't really need to explain. And for those of you who aren't afraid yet, well, hopefully you won't find out. But I figured with the recent goings on, one of the only things I can do right now is try to give some comfort or distraction to the people that I care about. And I also figured that it was a good time for me to read one of the first books that made me feel brave. This was actually a gift from my older brother when I was 14, I think. I actually read it so many times that I could tell if I had accidentally had two pages stick together because I knew the exact sequence of events in in the story. I knew it down to the page. Um, so I apologize that tonight's reading is going to be a little bit less than my usual highest quality, but I figured a cold read for something specifically to try and help you all feel brave is at least in the right spirit. So this is The Legend of Huma by Richard A. Knack. It is a book from the Dragonlance series of the. It's one of the specific realms of D&D. Um, so, yeah, like I said, this I've had this book for well on 22 years, and it is one of my most treasured possessions. So, prologue. It is very rare that I, Astinus, master historian of Kryn, find myself penning a personal note for inclusion in my chronicles. I have done so only once in recent memory, that being after the mage Raistlin came within a breadth of becoming an all-powerful deity, mightier even than Paladin and Takesis. He failed, else I probably would not be writing this, but it was a failure deserving note. Close Discord. Um, While commenting on that incident, I came to realize that a vicious error had been discovered in my older volumes. By the handwriting, I suspect that one Paulus Warius, an assistant of mine, some 3 centuries before, and notable more for his clumsiness than his ability to keep records, must have accidentally destroyed part of some 3 or 4 older volumes, and then replaced the damaged pieces with what he assumed were correct copies. They were not. Yes, dear. The error concerns the transitory period between between what are now called the Age of Light and the Age of Might. Ergoth, for instance, was a much older empire than is noted in the false history. Venus Solemnis, in fact, commanded Ergoth's armies by 2692 PC, not 14 centuries later, as the false history claims. The Second Dragon War, noted incorrectly as a Second and Third War by Warius, because it lasted more than 45 years, ended in 2645 PC. It was here I first learned of the grave mistakes, for I had opened the pages concerning those last few years in order to make reference to Huma, Knight of Solamnia, a man of very mortal flesh who faced and defeated Takesis, goddess of evil, the Dragon Queen. I had intended, after the end of the Second Dragon War, to note Huma's exploits, but, as it always happens, my mind was on my work. I have spent more time with this than I had originally allotted myself. Perhaps it is because I too felt some relief after that struggle, for I had been ready to close the final volume of this world's history at one point. It would have been a shame, as my collection at that time consisted of only a few 100,000 volumes. For this alone I remember Huma. His story, fortunately, is still intact in this volume, and I will let that speak for him. Signed, Astinus of Palathus, 360 AC. Chapter 1. The army passed through a village on its way northwest to Caire. The village, called Ceridan, had been set upon by plague, starvation, and madness, each seeming to take turns and each killing many of the inhabitants. In a lifetime long ago, the village had been prosperous. Now, shacks and makeshift shelters stood where clay brick buildings had fallen to the raids of bold goblins and marauding dark dragons. For some reason, the village had never been destroyed, it just continued to waste away, much like the people who tried to exist there. The appearance of a column of knights did little to cheer the village. In fact, the inhabitants seemed to feel more than a little resentment at the way the riders and foot soldiers paraded through the mud track that was all the village could call a road. The strife-worn residents felt resentment for the way of life they assumed the Knights of Salonia led, a way of life that they believed must be better than what each of them faced daily. At the head of the column, resplendent in his chain and plate armor, rode Lord Oswald of Baxtry. The intricate pattern of roses displayed on his breastplate revealed him to be a member of the Solamnic order that took the same flower for its symbol. The purple cloak that flowed behind him was attached by a clasp bearing the likeness of a kingfisher with its wings partly spread and a crown above its head. Below the bird, grasped tight in its claws, was a sword with a rose atop it. Most of the knights were clad as Lord Oswald, although their plate was much more worn and their cloaks tended to be plain in comparison with their commanders'. Lord Oswald's cloak was a sign of his rank, High Warrior, Master of the Order of the Rose, and currently second in command to the Grand Master, he who ruled the knighthood itself. As they rode, the High Warrior glanced quickly at the rider to his side. They might have been from the same mold, with their hawk-like features and the long, flowing mustaches that were popular among the knights. Oswald's features, though, were tempered by age and truer understanding of the world he lived in, whereas the other, younger by some 20-odd years, still held steady to the belief that his was the hand that would change the world. They were in fact related. Bennett was his nephew and son of Trake, the Grand Master himself. The arrogance so set in Bennett's face indicated that he already saw himself as his father's successor. Lord Oswald hoped Bennett would learn temperance by then. The young knight was of the mind that the knights followed the will of Paladine, and therefore that they would triumph because their cause was just. Lord Oswald knew that this was not always the case. The expressions of the younger knights in procession were carefully prepared emotionless masks. Soon enough they would learn the cruel facts of the world. Lord Oswald knew the younger knights, and many of the older ones, still saw themselves as heroes for a world already lost. One in particular Lord Oswald thought, and opened his mouth to shout, "Renard! Up front!" Huma watched the tall, almost gaunt knight ride forwards. If Lord Oswald wished to speak to Renard, then something was afoot. That something might involve Huma himself, for Renard seemed to watch him keenly, although Huma was already bloodied. Perhaps, like Huma himself, Renard still believed that there was one who never that here was one who never should have been accepted into its ranks. Huma bounced as his warhorse stumbled in the mud. The visor of his helmet slammed down in front of his face, startling him. He reached up and raised it, allowing the cool wind to bite at his handsome, if somewhat weathered features. Though his mustache was not as grand as that of Bennett or the High Warrior, there was some dignity in the slight gray that prematurely touched it and the rest of the hair on his head. His visage was surprisingly soft, so much so that others occasionally commented on his youth, although not when he was nearby. Huma could not help staring at the grimy, torn clothing of Ceriden's women and children. Even his own armor, worn as it was, and much less intricately decorated than that of Lord Oswald, seemed to be made of gold when compared to what they had. Their rags hung loosely, and Huma wondered how often these people ate, and how much, and what they ate for that matter. The rebellious part of his nature wanted to take his pack from his saddle and throw it to the villagers, let them have the rations stored in there. It probably would be the best meal they had eaten in weeks. "Keep up, you!" the knight behind him growled, and Huma realized how close he had actually come to giving away his rations. He knew it was wrong, as the knighthood rules proclaimed, but it was still a strong desire. Another sign of his inadequacies, he thought, with a sigh, and wondered why his petition to join the knighthood had ever been granted. His thoughts were interrupted by Renard. Like Huma, the older knight carried a shield whose markings proclaimed his place in the Order of the Crown. Renard, though, had many years of practical experience, and therefore was a commander in his own right. His visor hid all but the two piercing ice-blue eyes, and only hinted at the face. Renard had few friends even among the Order of the Crown. Renard returned Huma's stare, then looked at the section as a whole. "Gaynor, Huma, Trelane." He barked 8 names in all. "Break from column for patrol duty." The words betrayed no emotion. Renard was methodical, a strategist of high caliber. One could not ask for a better leader in time of combat. Nevertheless, his presence always seemed to chill some part of Huma's soul. Lord Oswald wants the dead woods to the south searched over, possibly goblins, maybe the ogres. We have to return to the column before sunset. Briefly, Renard looked up at the perpetually overcast sky. Always it seemed about to rain, but it never did. Before total darkness, we do not want to be in the woods at night, not this close to the western border. Understood? When the knights assented, he turned his horse, a tall, pale animal much like its rider, and signaled the others to follow. In minutes, thankfully, they were far away from Cerridon. The ground was hard and easier for the mounts to trot upon. That was not surprising. The fire, which had killed much of the forest they rode towards, had baked the nearest fields. No food would grow here for years to come. It was all so useless sometimes, Huma thought. Where was Paladin? Huma wondered that the god could allow this to happen, and he glanced at the ashy stubs of trees as the patrol rode along. Kryn might as well be in the claws of Takesis already, the way that things were going. He clamped his mouth tight, that he dared call himself a knight after thoughts such as that. As they reached the first patch of gnarled, twisted trees, the knights lowered their visors. From a distance they might have looked like demons, for the horns or wings that decorated the sides of each knight's helmet were now more evident. The more elaborate, the higher the rank, save in Renard's case. Typical of his ways, he had only a crest that rode from the front all the way down the back. The woods were but one more sorry victim of the seemingly endless war that had razed the continent of Ansalam. Huma wondered what this land had looked like before the Dragon Queen's creatures had ravaged it. The dead trees gave the woods an evil look. The patrol was unusually tense. Eyes darted here and there, and as each knight sought a foe behind the blackened trunks. Huma clutched at the hilt of his sword. For a brief moment, a motion seemed to catch his eye. A wolf? In this barren land? As the knights moved on, he noted no new movement. Nerves, there was no life in these woods. There was nothing but sorrow. Renard called for a halt with the raising of one hand. Even he did not seem to wish to speak, as if the sound would release an unwanted presence. "Spread out. You four to my right," he said, gesturing at Huma and three others. "The rest to my left." He drew his sword. The others followed suit and moved into position, with one man between Huma and the patrol leader. Renard gave the signal to advance. The knights kept a slow but steady pace. The woods curved over a hill, one of the few in this area. If goblins or orcs lurked anywhere nearby, they would be here. Renard pointed at the knight to Huma's left and sent the man forward. The rest of the patrol stopped and waited. The scout climbed off his horse and made his way up to the top of the rise. The others watched anxiously as he peered over the top and as quietly and quickly as he could, returned to the knights and horses. Huma, who had taken the reins of the other's horse, handed them back. "Well?" Renard asked quietly. "Goblins. The ugly creatures are eating. A marauder patrol, I think. Must be at least 20, no more than several dozen, I think." Renard nodded in satisfaction. "Nothing we cannot handle." Huma thanked Paladin that his visor hid his own worried face. Renard pointed to the scout, Huma, and the two knights to Huma's right. "Ride round the right side. We'll take the left. When you hear an owl, ride in. Huma, you'll take charge of your group." Some of the other knights shifted uneasily, but no one would argue. Huma gazed at the visors of his three companions and had no trouble reading the eyes of each man. He almost asked that someone replace him as leader, but Renard was already turning his band away. Huma chose to say nothing, and he turned to his own mount. Whatever their personal feelings, the three were knights of Solamnia. They had been given an order, and they would obey. To his relief, they followed him without murmur. The ride was not long, but it was slow and cautious. The goblins were sloppy in every aspect of their lives, including military procedure, but there might be an enterprising leader among them who might have thought to post guards. Goblins, in general, were of little strategic use in the plans of the Dragon Queen's warlord, save as marauders. Knowing this, and knowing that most goblins fought with little if any true skill, did not ease Huma's mind, however. Huma could see no guards, and he dared to climb from his horse and survey the goblin camp from a small rise. That the creatures were ugly was an understatement. Their skins were sickly green, teeth protruded from every inch of their mouths, and their eyes reminded the knights of frogs' eyes. The goblins were squat and misshapen, but they were also very strong. Many carried axes, and a couple even hefted crude bows. Their armor appeared to be compilations of everything that they could rummage from the battlefields. As Huma watched, a goblin came rushing over to his apparent leader, who was twice as big and ugly as many of his subordinates. The smaller goblin whispered something to the patrol leader, who stiffened and barked out orders. Huma knew what had happened. Either the newcomer had been a guard, or he had wandered away from the camp for some reason. Whatever the case, the goblins apparently realized that Renard and the others were approaching from the other direction, and they were now preparing a fight. Within seconds, the normally disorganized goblins had formed themselves into an attack formation that, with the element of surprise, meant that Renard and his companions would almost certainly be struck down. There was no time to send someone to warn them. "Get ready!" Huma whispered as he climbed back onto his horse, sword in hand. He turned back to the others. "We go now!" "Now?" one of the others asked. The trio looked from one to another and back to Huma. Huma had no time for their hesitation. Sword and shield ready, he kicked his mount in the sides. The horse charged, and Huma, waving his blade above his head, shouted the charge. "Paladin!" His courage shocked him, but no more than it shocked the goblins. As one, the creatures turned to face this unexpected menace. The horse charged into the midst of the camp, the knight's sword already coming down on the nearest goblin. The goblin raised his rusty broadsword in some semblance of defense, but Huma's swing shattered the weapon and then the owner itself. Huma's only desire was to cut down as many of the enemy as possible and give Renard and his men the chance that they needed. Another goblin fell to his sword, and then the rest rushed towards the lone attacker, readying bows and raising pikes. The goblins would not be content to take him prisoner, they knew. Then Huma heard the shouts behind him and knew that the other three had joined the fray. He fought with greater enthusiasm now, knowing that a chance for life still existed. Some of the goblins broke away from the four horsemen. The others tried to regroup under the hurried commands of the patrol leader. More battle cries filled the air, and Huma glanced up to see Renard and the others coming from the goblins' rear. Those of the enemy patrol who had tried to flee fell under the powerful hooves of the war horses. Renard methodically cut down two who tried to stand against him. Then he urged his mount onwards. His movements hinted of a near eagerness. One of the knights in Huma's group was dragged from his horse, and a heavy axe finished him before Huma could react. Seconds later, Huma rode down the goblin standing over his kill. The ugly creature had only time to look up before the war horse's front hooves caught him in the head, cracking the skull open. The goblins, knowing they were lost, fought with a rare determination. Only 3 horsemen blocked their path to freedom. Huma barely blocked a savage swing, an arrow flew past his head, and suddenly a howl shivered through the air. Something leapt at Huma's steed. The knight caught a brief vision of something akin to a wolf in form, but the resemblance ended with the thing's corpse-white pallor, as though it had been skinned. The yellow, dripping fangs seemed as long as his fingers and sharp as needles. Then Huma's war horse screamed and turned, despite the knight's protests. Straining every muscle, the animal raced from the skirmish, mindless of the frantic rider clinging to it. Somewhere close behind, the thing howled again. Huma could only clutch the reins and hang on for the wild ride. The sounds of fighting faded as the maddened horse rushed deeper and deeper into the charred forest. What could so terrorize a trained war horse? Certainly no earthly beast. Then, even that thought vanished from Huma's mind, as his mount broke through the blackened limbs of a knot of trees and found the earth was suddenly far, far below. Chapter 2. It was dark when Huma returned to consciousness. Lunatari and Wayne glittered weakly, casting a slight crimson tinge. Like blood, Huma thought, and then he forced that thought quickly away. If Lunatari were in Wayne, which of the other moons would be waxing? Solinari was nowhere to be seen. If it was indeed Lunatari that waxed, Huma would never know it. No one saw the dark moon, no one save the black robes, whose mages worshipped the dark god of magic. The dark moon was invisible to common folk, and perhaps even to those who followed the paths of white and red magic as well. As his senses cleared, he became more aware of his surroundings. The horse lay beneath him, its neck broken by the fall. The heavy padding in Huma's armor, combined with the mass of the horse, had prevented the knight's death. He tried to rise and nearly blacked out. All that padding had not been enough to prevent a concussion. While he waited for his head to clear again, Huma looked around. This might once have been a river in a time when the rains had fallen more often. Its depth, at least 4 times Huma's height, was more than enough to kill a crazed steed, even one as strong as the war horse. The other side of the riverbed lay some distance away. Judging by the sickly growths that barely could be called plants, he suspected that this river had dried up many, many years before, possibly in the early days of the war, when the Dragon Queen had sought a quick, decisive victory over the followers of Paladin. Huma dared once more attempt to stand. He found that the poundings in his head subsided to mere annoyance if he did not bend his neck abruptly nor look down too swiftly. With this in mind, he succeeded in staying on his feet. Gods! The word came unbidden, for Huma was only just now realizing that he was alone in hostile territory. The others must think him dead. Dead, or perhaps a coward who had run. A mist was developing, sending cold, feathery fingers wisping through the ravine. He could wait out the night and begin his trek back at first light, which might mean walking to another goblin patrol. Or he could travel by night and pray that whatever lurked out there would be just as blind in the dark mist as he. Neither prospect pleased him, but he could think of no other choice. So he found that the pain in his head had lessened a bit, so that now he was able to search the ground for his sword. It lay nearby, undamaged. His pack was another problem. Part of it was buried beneath his mount, and while Huma was strong, the animal's position made it virtually impossible for him to either lift the horse or roll it over. He had to satisfy himself with a few rations, and tinder blocks, and flint, and a few personal items pried from the unhindered portion of the pack. Huma did not like the thought of traveling by night, but he liked the idea of traveling alone in plain sight by daylight even less. He picked up his things and, sword in hand, started up the sides of the riverbed. The mist would be thinner above, and the high ground was always more advantageous strategically. At least, Huma hoped so. The mist never got worse, but neither did it get any better. Huma could make out most of the stars, but his ground-level vision extended only about 10 feet or so, and he was hard-pressed to make out details in the red moon's weak attempt at illuminating the shroud-covered land. The sword stayed at the ready in Huma's left hand. He had no shield, it must have been lost in the horse's mad flight. Thinking of that, Huma could not help remembering the demonic visage that he had glimpsed. If that thing were out there somewhere. His grip on the hilt tightened. He had traveled an hour when he heard the harsh mocking voices. Goblins. Huma ducked behind a rotting tree trunk. No more than 10 yards separated him from them. Only the mist had saved him. At least 3, maybe 4 goblins seemed to be joking over the fate of someone. A prisoner, perhaps. Although one part of Huma urged him to slip away safely, the other demanded that he lend whatever aid he could. Carefully he slipped closer and listened. A rusty, grating voice jarred his aching head.
I think's the warlord himself will reward us for this one.
A deeper voice joined the first.
Maybe he'll give us the bull. I'd like to be the first one to skin him for a rug. He killed Guyver. You know, I like Guyver. He owed me money. No, I'll never get it.
A third voice cut in.
How do you think the ogres will kill him?
Huma strained his ears and caught the sound of a knife being sharpened on a stone.
Real slow, they got sneaky minds for that kind of stuff.
Something rattled chains, and Huma tried to place the location. Somewhere far to the right, he thought.
He's awake. Let's have some fun.
Chains rattled again, and a voice, resonant and spanning the distance with no trouble, responded,
Give me a weapon and let me fight. Ha! The goblin snickered. You'd like that, wouldn't you, cow-face? We ain't fools, you know. You'll do until something comes along.
You'll do until some come along. Suddenly the voice grunted as if exerting great effort. The goblin voices, 4, Huma estimated, quieted until the grunting became a gasp for breath, and the chains rattled.
I thought you was going to do it for a minute. 2 coppers tell you... 2 coppers will get you that he can. Will get you that he can. What? You fool! You'd bet on something like that?
Guyver would have. Huma, so engrossed in the goblins, almost missed the soft tread behind him. When he did, he was sure that he had been seen. The newcomer, though, continued walking, and Huma soon realized that the creature, a goblin guard, could not see well in the mist. Still, a few steps more would bring the goblin close enough that not even a dense fog could save the night. Summoning his courage, Huma quietly circled behind the guard. He matched the goblin step for step, save that his own stride was again half as long. Each step brought him that much closer. Only a few more. A roar bellowed angrily from the camp. Knight and goblin turned without thinking, then stared at one another as realization sank in. Huma was the first to react, leaping at the goblin in a desperate attempt to silence him. Sword and body caught the creature and it fell to the ground, but not before the goblin let out a muffled shout.
Pig sticker!
Huma cursed his luck and scrambled away from the body. The goblins had abandoned tormenting their captive, who was evidently the source of the bellowing, and were now cautiously making their way in the direction they believed their companion called out from.
Pig sticker! He probably tripped on a rock again. Well, what's he gone and done then? Cracked open his egg? Pig sticker! I think we should stay here. Stay back here, just in case. Sneeze back there. You come with us or I'll give you a piece of what the bull's getting. Okay.
The goblins were making more than enough noise to cover Huma's movements, and the mist hid him even though one of the creatures, amazingly, had thought to carry a torch. They soon would come across the body of their dead comrade, though, and that would bring Huma's advantage to an end. His maneuvers brought him close to the perimeter of the camp. He thought he saw a large shape huddled on the ground with perhaps a horned helm on top of its head, but the mist gave odd proportions for a human, or even an elf or dwarf. A campfire burned low, a shadowy, lumpy figure moved near it, and Huma knew that this must be the goblin Snee, who had been left to guard the prisoner. Despite the low illumination of the fire, Huma had no delusions about his chances of sneaking up on the goblin. The ground ahead gave no cover, and the jittery goblin was turning this way and that. Huma made out what appeared to be a wicked two-handed axe in its paws. Huma's free hand flattened across some small rocks, and the glimmerings of a plan flickered in his concussion-racked head. Taking a handful of rocks, he dared to get up to his knees. With a quick prayer to Paladin, he threw them to the far side of the camp, away from the prisoner. The guard reacted predictably, much to Huma's relief. As the goblin scurried to investigate, Huma scooped up another handful of pebbles, stood up, and quietly made his way towards the back of the prisoner. Midway there, he threw the other handful, this time assuring that they would go even farther. His heart-pounding heat covered the remaining ground. What are you up to, Mischief? What are you up to? Are you interrupting? Do you perhaps want to eat the paper towel that I've been blowing my nose into today? That is a very gross thing to do. Opal would like to go to bed, but Dad is evil and incapable of feeling. Even though Opal is only capable of love and mischief and helping Dad with his eat. I know. I am the worst. I am the worst dad ever in a long history of indignities. I love you. You're a good girl. You're going to have to wait, though.
Will you stop that? I'm not going to let you eat tissues. I know you're cute. She is so difficult. Here, I'll turn on the fan for you. I swear, ridiculous dogs.
The guard reacted predictably, much to Huma's relief. As the goblins scurried to investigate, Huma scooped up another handful of pebbles, stood up, and quietly made his way towards the back of the prisoner. Midway there, he threw another handful, this time assuring that they would go even further. His heart pounding, he covered the remaining ground. Whoever the prisoner was, he was huge, and smelly. The helmet actually seemed to be some sort of headdress, although Huma did not examine it closely enough to be sure. "Be very still," Huma whispered. Huma felt the body stiffen, but no reply came. From his angle, Huma could see that, unlike the arms, which were chained, the legs were only bound with rope. He reached down to his belt and pulled out a dagger, even as the other goblins suddenly let out a collective shout. They had discovered their comrade. "Cut your bonds and run! I'll do my best to give you time!" Even as he said it, Huma wondered at his own daring or foolishness. It was hard to say which. He only knew that, as a knight, it was his duty to risk his life for others. Huma straightened even as Snee hurried back to find the reason for the shouting. At first, the goblin mistook Huma for one of his companions, but recognition followed almost instantly, and the goblin brought his axe around for a wild swing at the young knight. Huma dodged easily and nicked the goblin in one arm. At that, some sense returned to Tisni, and the goblin called out for help. There was no skill in the goblin's attacks, only brute force. Huma easily dodged each swing of the axe, but he knew that each moment of delay cost him greatly. Already he could hear the other goblins stomping back up to camp. Then the other goblin, who was the apparent leader, gave a shout of surprise and yelled, "The bull's loose!" Indeed, something was loose, and Huma wondered who or what exactly he had released. With a wild, primitive cry, the shadowy form went tearing past Huma. The startled goblin dropped its axe with a clatter and followed it to the ground immediately afterwards. Unarmed and with its hands chained, yet the other surely could not survive against three opponents. Yet, when Huma turned to offer aid, his first view was of a giant, hulking form that overwhelmed the goblins as if they were small children. One had gotten too close and now squirmed helplessly in the air above the former prisoner's head. The other two were backing away fearfully. Huma paused, suddenly unsure if moving closer was a wise move. The freed prisoner tossed the hapless goblin at the nearest of its two comrades, who, dodging the living projectile, squeaked and turned to flee. The two goblins collided with a bone-breaking crunch. It fell into a heap and lay still. The lone survivor did not have time to react. The tall, muscular figure reached forward with both arms and wrapped its metal chain around the panic-stricken goblin's neck. With a single jerk that gave evidence of strength in those massive arms, the chain snapped the goblin's head back. The lifeless form dropped to the ground like a sack of oats. Huma came to a halt some 20 feet from the prisoner he had released. Whatever it was at least a foot taller than Huma, who was no small man himself, and almost twice as wide. The arms looked to be as thick as Huma's legs, and the legs looked as if they could bear the owner through a 20-mile run without any sign of strain. The other had been satisfied to contemplate his revenge, but now, as he straightened, he seemed to be studying the night. Again, the voice was deep and resounding. "You have my gratitude, Knight of Salamnia. I owe you my life, a debt I can never repay, but one that I shall endeavor to compensate you for if it takes the rest of my days." Huma stayed poised, but some of his unease vanished. "You owe me nothing. Anyone would have done the same." The tall figure chuckled ominously. "Would they?" He turned to face the knight, and, even in the dim light, it was obvious that the one he had freed was no man nor elf. The horns were part of the creature, as was the thick, dark fur that covered the top and much of the back. As the goblins had so crudely put it, the other resembled nothing less than a bull with the body of a man. A minotaur. The minotaur took a few slow steps towards Huma, as if to prove that he meant no harm. Although Huma's training cried out that this was an enemy, and one of the most fierce, his natural curiosity was fascinated by the creature. Few in the region ever saw a minotaur. The creature's homeland was far away on the eastern coast of Ansalon. Still, Huma's curiosity did not prevent him from raising his sword to a more defensive position. The creature's head seemed overly large even for a body as massive as the minotaur's. Dark, thick fur covered the top and the back half, and a thin fuzz covered the rest. The minotaur's eyes were much like those of a real bull, save that an intelligence lurked in those orbs. The snout was short and broad, and the teeth that the creature's grin revealed looked more adapted to tearing flesh than green grass. Huma remembered some of the stories about this race, and he took an involuntary step backwards. The minotaur held up his long, wide hands and displayed the chains that bound them together. The fingers were thicker and more blunt than a man's, and they ended in sharp nails. No, claws. Huma's own hands were like those of a year-old child in comparison. Unlike the goblins, who always need 6 times the number of their adversaries before they even dream of an attack, I think you have an advantage over me. I'm sure you know how to use that fine weapon. I do, Huma finally managed to blurt out. What were you doing here? Why were you a prisoner of these goblins? I've always heard that minotaurs were allies of the ogres. The crimson illumination of the moon gave the former captive's eyes a fearsome look. Slave soldiers would be a better term, Knight of Salamnia. We are no more than slaves to our cousins. They hold our lands and our families as hostages, though they would use it as the word that they would use is protection. That is why we do what they cannot. One day, though, it will be the Minotaurs who will rule. We wait that day. Which does not explain why you are a prisoner here. Huma presented as confident a face as he could muster. It would not take much of that Minotaur's strength to snap the young knight's neck. He'd already seen proof of that. The beast-man dropped his shackled arms and snorted. I killed my ogre captain, human. I struck him down with my bare hands. A good blow cracked his skull with one shot. The thought of striking, much less actually murdering a superior, appalled the knight. He raised his visor and dared to step close to the Minotaur. You murdered him? You like ogres? Thanks to me, no lives will be lost against his axe, and he was good, I'll give him that. Many died on that axe, human, even the weak, the helpless. I found him over the bodies of an aged male and 2 children, perhaps the old human's grandchildren. I did what I thought right. There is no honor in slaughtering the old, the feeble, or the young, at least not among my kind. Not that they would have tolerated my betrayal. I thought it would be so among the knights of Solamnia, too. I see that I may have misunderstood. The Minotaur held up the chained wrists once more, causing Huma to take several quick steps back. Either kill me or free me from these chains. I do not care to discuss this. The goblins have drugged what little food they gave me. This exertion has almost done me in. Indeed, the Minotaur was slumping. Huma came to a decision, overturned it, came to another, and finally settled again on the first. Even then, he did not act. Could he truly believe the words of the strange figure before him? The Minotaurs were supposedly an honorable race, but they served the gods of evil. That was the way it was always taught. Huma's sword arms shivered, as much from his thoughts as from the long, awkward position he held it in. The man-beast waited patiently, as ready to die as to be freed. The calm and faith with which the former captive faced his rescuer finally made Huma's decision for him. He slowly and carefully sheathed the blade. Which one of these had the keys? The Minotaur fell to his knees. His breath came in huge huffs, like a bull about to charge. The one I threw. You will have them if any do. I never saw keys. They had no reason for them. After all, why would they want to release me? While the exhausted defector rested, Huma went over to the goblin and checked the numerous pouches wrapped around the creature's waist. Each held a large number of items, many of them disgusting trophies of war, knowing goblins more likely looted from the dead, and a few unrecognizable. In one of the pouches, he found the keys. The Minotaur's eyes were closed, and Huma suddenly worried that one of the goblins had, after all, inflicted some mortal wound. At the clinking of the keys near its face, though, the burly figure opened its eyes. My thanks, he said, after Huma had freed both wrists. By my ancestors 20 generations back, I will not rest until I have balanced the scale. You have my oath on that. There's no need. It was my duty. Somehow, the Minotaur managed a very human expression of skepticism. Nevertheless, I will honor my oath as I see fit, that it not be said that Kaz is less than his ancestors. Huma stood. Can you walk? Give me a moment. Kaz looked around quickly. Besides, I have no desire to be out in the open tonight. I would prefer some sort of shelter. From what? Huma could not imagine what would worry such a powerful fighter unless it was a dragon or some creature of similar proportions. Kaz rose slowly. The captain was a current favorite of the warlord. I fear he might have unleashed some of the renegade's pets. I don't understand. The Minotaur suddenly turned his attention to acquiring a decent weapon. He spotted the axe dropped by Huma's first opponent, picked it up, and tested it. Good. Probably dwarven. To Huma he replied, Let us hope that there is no need. I do not think either of us would live through it. In the hands of the goblin, the axe had looked large. Kaz, however, wielded it with the ease of one who is used to weapons of even greater size. The axe was meant for two-handed use. The Minotaur needed only one massive paw to grasp it. In which direction did you plan to go? North. To Caire? Huma hesitated. He knew that many knights, even Bennett, would never have released such a creature from its bonds. They would have marched it at sword point through the wasteland. Most certainly, they would never tell the Minotaur the final destination. If the so-called prisoner was in actuality a spy, such a slip of the tongue might prove fatal for more than just Huma. Yet, Kaz seemed a person of honor. Huma held back only a moment more, then finally nodded. Yes, Caire, I hope to rejoin my comrades. The Minotaur swung the axe over his own shoulder and attached it to what Huma realized was a harness designed for just such a purpose. It was one of the only pieces of clothing that Kaz wore, the other being a sort of kilt or perhaps some large loincloth. I fear that Caire is an unwise choice for now, but I will not argue you out of it. Why unwise? Kaz gave his imitation of a human smile, a smile filled with anticipation. Caire is now on the front. My cousins, the ogres, must be there even as we speak. He chuckled, sounding again like a snorting bull. It will be a glorious struggle. I wish I could be there. Huma grimaced at the obvious pleasure in killing that his new companion expressed. Some of the tales concerning the strange minotaurs were evidently all too true. Steeling himself, Huma wiped the drying blood from his weapon. He glanced only briefly at his newfound companion, who seemed to recognize some of the revulsion in Huma's face. You may come back with me or go back on your own, Kaz, Huma said. Whatever you desire. You may find the knighthood leery of accepting you as a deserter. Kaz did not hesitate. I know some of what you feel, Knight of Solamnia. I understand all too well our many differences. Still, I owe you a debt, and I would rather face your comrades than return to my own ranks to a slow torture before I am executed. I have no desire to face ogres' tender mercies. Something howled in the night, far away. It was a wolf, Huma decided, yet not a wolf. It was too cold and too evil. We'd best be off, Kaz quickly decided. This is no place to be at night. The scent of death is sure to draw visitors here, and I, knight, would prefer to move on. Huma's eyes were still staring back at the direction of the cry. He nodded sharply, suddenly much more pleased with the Minotaur's companionship. Agreed. He reached out his right hand in friendship. My name, friend Kaz, is Huma. Huma. The pressure exerted by the hand that covered Huma's was not enough to crush every bone, but it came close. A strong name. A warrior's name. Huma turned quickly away and picked up his bags. How wrong the Minotaur could be. A warrior indeed. Within his armor, Huma could feel every portion of his body shiver. He tried to imagine Bennett in his place, acting in the proper manner of a knight born to command. He thought the thought only frustrated Huma more, for he knew that Bennett would never have ended up in a situation such as this. They left the camp with its dying fire and scattered refuse, and headed in the direction Huma had chosen. Neither spoke now for varying reasons. Behind them, thankfully, sounding no closer than before, the cry rose again. Alright, so I wanted to switch books, but I figure 45 minutes of probably the best book I could choose considering their circumstances, I think is a good choice. So get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And people can hate you for no reason. God, it seems like that's a lot, and that's happening a lot these days. I can love you even more than that. Keep your chin up. There will be happiness again. And I'm here. I'll be right by your side. So, do your best.